I got seas going right across my deck here now. I did not 3 weeks report up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. So this is good too, Roger. Thanks for that information, sir, and I'll get back to you if we come up with anything. Over.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner. I'm one of your hosts today, and I'll be joined by Taylor, as usual, in just a minute here. First, we have some new patrons to thank, so would like to say a big Beyond the Breakers thank you to Sensual Kazoo, Ken, and David. So thank you for your support over on Patreon. For any of you listening who are not on Patreon, we just announced kind of a new structure to our release schedule where we're just kind of alternating each week, doing a main episode and then a bonus on Patreon and then a main and then a bonus. $3 a month gets you one of those bonuses. $5 a month gets you both of those bonus episodes. So something to consider if you want a little bit more of the show. With that, let's have Taylor come in. So Taylor, how is it going?
Hello, I am broadcasting live from my kitchen table today. Out of the office, it is being used by Darcy for her real job. I don't have to work.
Because it is technically a work day for a lot of people.
Uh-huh. But it's I don't know, I kind of like recording in a different place, actually. Kind of keeps you from being bored.
We are recording on Black Friday of 2024, November 29th. Instead of being out shopping, this is what we're doing today.
I spent all morning scouring the internet for deals, and there aren't any. Nothing's actually on sale. I hate it.
We're doing praxis by staying home and podcasting today. So what have you been up to?
Let's see. The last couple days, I saw Wicked over the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
It was really good. I enjoyed it. I have not seen the play. I've not read the book. I was a little suspect going into it, especially with like Ariana Grande's name being attached to it. Mm-hmm. She actually did a great job. I'm kind of a fan of hers now after watching this. It was really good.
Yeah, I enjoyed the stage production. I saw that in high school. I actually get to see it for free because the like chorus and band at school was going, and they just had some extra seats in Chicago, and I was like, oh, sure, I'll go. So I got to see Wicked. That was cool. I did read the book also. I enjoyed that one, and I read the next one, Son of a Witch.
I've been told the book is very different than the play.
There's a lot more. I mean, I kind of like the world building and the lore. I mean, obviously, it's scaffolded on L. Frank Baum's writing, but there is a lot of cool stuff there. I will say, of the Gregory Maguire that I've read, sexual assault plays a weirdly primary role in some of the plot point, like a weird amount.
Kind of his go-to crutch,
which is sort of, off-putting. But yeah, I definitely do want to watch the movie.
Yeah, it was really good. Outside of that, I started a new book, Black Flags: The Rise of ISIS by Joby Warwick, which I just started it yesterday, so I don't have a whole lot to say about it yet. But I've sort of been on a kick here of trying to understand a lot of the stuff that was going on when, I don't know, I guess from my middle school years through college years, where you kind of experience all these things and you hear about it, but you don't really understand the context of it. And now I think there's finally been like enough time that we can put some of this stuff in context. And I don't know, it's very interesting. I've enjoyed learning a lot about that and kind of understanding the complexity of these situations that, like we were talking about before we started recording. It's not as simple as like good guy, bad guy. There's a lot of shades of gray here.
That's funny because I just recently got another Patrick Coburn, one of his more recent ones. It's called The Age of Jihad, and it's essentially covering similar things of how, because he's reported a lot from Iraq and tracing, how does the ripple effect of one thing lead to another, especially with a group like ISIS, where I think if you were primarily just consuming mainstream news, ISIS is one of those things that seems like it kind of came out of nowhere. Suddenly there's this new terror group and they hold all this territory.
It was like suddenly like out there's Al Qaeda and now there's new Al Qaeda is literally like how it got pushed. I feel like.
Whereas, of course, there had been people researching and following these things the whole time, saying, "Hey, this is kind of the next thing that's going to be happening," and it was.
I think, like one of the interesting things in the book I just finished about Afghanistan, like up to September 10th, 2001, how much like we think of it as monolithic, but like the Pashtun Taliban fighters hated the Arab fighters that came in. They didn't want anything to do with them. And, even like people that groups that were part of the Taliban that were like the Pashtuns had their cliques, non-Pashtuns had theirs. Like it's never a monolith. Everyone has their own objectives and aims and goals. It's just interesting how they wrap it up.
Yeah, I know there you've also got like the Tajiks who are like playing a role there. Obviously fascinating on one level, and then it's like, well, this is also like a real on the ground thing for so many people. Like this is a real part of life.
Well, I think, and then like the other thing you understand is like, all right, so it's 2008 and you're a 18-year-old kid who's in the Marine Corps. Do you even care? Like, do you care that that's ISIS or Al Qaeda or the Taliban? Like, not really.
It's somebody that you're allowed to shoot.
It's someone you're allowed to shoot and someone that's probably trying to set up an IED. So like, like, does it even matter when you're on the ground?
Yeah.
I mean, the answer is yes, but.
Yeah, I haven't started into that Coburn yet, but I will at some point.
Nice. What have you been up to?
I've been trying to catch up on some podcasts. I have been not very faithful with a lot of them that I like to listen to.
I've been a lot more selective. I just haven't been listening to them just to listen to them. I don't know. My tastes are slightly changing or something.
I kind of go through phases where if I'm either doing a lot of reading or otherwise I'm doing a lot of podcast listening while I do other stuff. But yeah, try to get caught up a bit on some stuff. A bit of a more full shout out to our friend Nick's new podcast, Save Me. They're going through right now the Superman movies.
Nice.
I've just listened to the first episode, but it did make me watch the original, like the 1978 Superman, which I had never really seen before.
Yeah, I've never seen that.
I enjoyed the movie more than I thought. And the podcast was really informative about, stuff going on behind the scenes and how this was shot and how this was written. It was really, really cool. Even I think as someone who's not really into superhero movies per se, that was really cool. So definitely I can give a full throated endorsement of the Save Me podcast for everyone to check out.
Cool.
Aside from that, I've just started reading a book called Mau Mau, An African Crucible. The extraordinary story behind the bloody liberation of Kenya in the 1950s and the British deception that hid the truth from the world. Been trying to read a bit more about revolutionary movements in Africa, just because that's kind of a weaker spot in, what I've read about historically, having read a bit more about Central and South America and Asia and a lot less about Africa. So I'm looking forward to getting into that. The Mau Mau Rebellion is something that, it kind of gets referenced a lot. But it's at a time where I don't really know that much about what's going on in the colonial parts of Africa with the British Empire and former British Empire. That's what I've been up to.
Nice light reading as always for both of us.
I'm also still pushing through that book, The Vortex, the environmental history of the world. But that's a big one.
Yeah, I imagine that is a dense read at times.
Actually, the chapter I just got through was about ship breaking in Chittagong in Bangladesh, which is really interesting. Might actually work as like a feature to discuss on a bonus episode or something.
Yeah, actually that stuff is really interesting. I've read some articles about that before.
Because that specific location sort of develops almost accidentally as a place, to go for ship breaking. So it's kind of an interesting story though. So anyway, we have our own ship breaking to talk about today.
Self-breaking, even.
I had originally billed this as a 2-part episode, and as so often happens on this show, it has morphed into a 3-part episode. It has expanded to cover much more territory than we thought, much like an oil spill. So this is part 2 of the Torrey Canyon. In part 1, we covered some of the background information about the oil tanker SS Torrey Canyon and the captain on her final voyage, Pestringo Ruggiati. We finished part 1 on the morning of March 18th, 1967, in the moments leading up to the grounding that ended Torrey Canyon's career. In this episode, we'll look at the hours leading up to the grounding, the oil spill itself, and the initial attempts at salvage. And then in part 3, we'll get into more of the attempts at cleanup, some of the ecological impact, and then the legal ramifications and aftermath of these things. We will also have a $3 bonus episode spinning off of this that I'm really looking forward to. It involves a different ship from the same company. Let's talk about how this wreck actually happened.
Okay, I like shipwrecks.
So Richard Petrow, in his book, the kind of the main narrative source that I'm basing this episode off of. Once we get into part 3, I have a lot more diverse array of sources. But for the kind of narrative aspects, I'm using In the Wake of Torrey Canyon by Richard Petrow. He describes in a lot of detail the grounding itself. So the voyage from Mina al-Ahmadi in Kuwait down around the Cape of Good Hope and back up north towards Britain had been uneventful. And that puts us on board the Torrey Canyon in the early morning of March 18th, 1967.
That's not good when you give specific times and dates.
Nope, yep, we're going to get into some very specific times here shortly. So to start out with a quote here from Petrow.
By 2 a.m., Torrey Canyon had reached a position approximately 100 miles south of the southwestern tip of Great Britain. Captain Ruggiati had brought his vessel from the Persian Gulf around the Cape of Good Hope and up the Atlantic. He had made good time since his departure from Mina al-Ahmadi.
Ahead of him now lay the Scilly Isles, 21 miles from Land's End in Cornwall. Between the Scillies and Land's End stand the treacherous Seven Stones Shoals.
The shoals are misnamed. Actually, 8 rocks break the surface of the sea at low water. The largest of them all, the giant Pollard Rock, looms menacingly above the water at low tide to mark the northwest boundary of the reef.
But all of this detail about the Seven Stones Reef is really immaterial, since Captain Ruggiati had no intention of coming close to the reef.
One final thought on the reef, for now at least. Thanks to global warming, maybe there really will only be 7 rocks at some point, and the name will be appropriate.
That's possible. So the standard route for vessels approaching from the south was to stay well seaward of the Scillies, and then swing back starboard for the Bristol Channel.
I do want to say that the Scillies, and even though it's spelled totally different, is a silly name for some islands. It's very British.
It's a silly name. Let's not go to Camelot. It's a silly place. Milford Haven, the destination for Torrey Canyon, is just north of the Bristol Channel. So if you look at Google Maps, where it shows the lines for sea routes in this area, you'll notice that none of them go between the Scillies and the coast of Cornwall. It's not an area of major large ship navigation because it's not that much out of your way to go seaward of them, where it's much safer. Captain Ruggiati left the bridge around 2:30 a.m. on the morning of the 18th, having written out his orders for First Officer Silvano Bonfiglio. One of these orders was to call him when the Scillies appeared on radar. In the event that this didn't happen, a call was to be placed to the captain's cabin at 6 a.m. regardless. So if they were maybe off course or delayed, whatever, call me at 6 regardless of what happens. Bonfiglio was actually set to come to the bridge at 4 a.m., with that hour and a half-ish gap to be covered by Second Officer Pier Paolo Fontana. When Bonfiglio got to the bridge at 4 a.m., he read the captain's orders and went about assessing the vessel's position. At 5 a.m., he turned on the Torrey Canyon's Raytheon 1400 radar, with a maximum range of 40 miles. With the Scillies not yet appearing on screen, Bonfiglio called the captain at 6 a.m. as instructed. When asked for an estimate, Bonfiglio guessed that they would be sighting the Scillies by 7 a.m. Ruggiati told him to call again when he had made contact. Quoting here from Petrow.
Within half an hour of his first call to Captain Ruggiati, Bonfiglio observed the first shadowy outline of the Scilly Isles begin to appear on the screen. The position of the landmass, however, came as a shock. The Scillies, instead of lying to the right off the starboard bow, were appearing to the left off the port bow. What are they using set to mean there? Like flow, basically?
Yeah, like the way it's working.
I guess I've just never seen set used that way.
Well, also, one thing I noticed is that Petrow, since he's not necessarily a maritime writer, is that at times it's kind of weird because he'll use like right and left instead of port and starboard, which seems odd in a ship situation. But
the set of the current, Bonfiglio reasoned, had forced the vessel off course by about 8 miles. The ship was much further to the right than she should have been.
No big deal, though. This is a simple enough adjustment. Bonfiglio moved the steering control lever from automatic to manual and ordered the helmsman to come left to 006 degrees. So this is off of the vessel's original autopilot bearing of 018 degrees.
Interesting.
He's trying to bring it closer to seaward.
Right.
A bit more detail here. Bonfiglio would later explain this order as getting the vessel back on her original course. His idea was to make this partial correction and let Ruggiati make any decision to turn further to port. So he knows what the vessel's plan is. He knows what the captain had originally wanted to do. And so he's basically putting in a position to make that easier if Ruggiati confirms that's what they're going to do. As things were, his course change brought the Torrey Canyon directly on course for Bishop Rock Lighthouse at Scilly Isles' southwest corner. Although this was about 24 miles away at the time, or about an hour and a half sailing time. So it's not like this is an imminent collision course he has put it on.
It still seems kind of bad, though, to be like, I know I'm going towards the shoals.
I think also here, though, if he had kept it where it was going, it still would be going off of the planned course. So I think here it might be an issue of kind of not knowing, okay, what is the plan B if something happens to plan A?
I just feel like, why wouldn't you go ahead and fully correct it so that you're not in, like, tracking towards that lighthouse?
Well, we're about to see. So with this course change made, he called Captain Ruggiati in his cabin.
Captain, he reported, I have tracked the Scilly Isles on radar. We have moved to the right of the course. I have headed the bow for the Scilly Isles. I am heading for the Scilly Isles.
Ruggiati's reaction surprised Bonfiglio. Captain Ruggiati was angry. He admonished the first officer for changing course without consulting him. Then he demanded, with our original heading of 18 degrees, would we be free of the Scillies?
Yes, Bonfiglio replied.
Then continue on course 18 degrees, Captain Ruggiati ordered. I intend to pass to the starboard of the Scilly Isles. So after this exchange, Ruggiati told Bonfiglio that he would be up on the bridge in a few minutes. So this is one reason maybe that if Bonfiglio didn't make that change, maybe he didn't make the whole change because, I don't know, maybe he wasn't quite sure what Captain Ruggiati would want. And as we can see here, his reaction is kind of surprising to Bonfiglio.
Sounds like poor bridge resource management to me.
Possibly, yes. That might come up later also. Reaching the bridge just after 7 a.m., Captain Ruggiati checked the vessel's position to ensure that Bonfiglio had followed his instructions. He had. However, the turn to port had now forced Torrey Canyon into a much shallower angle of attack for hitting the passage between the Scillies and Seven Stones Reef. At the right angle, the safe channel between these two was about 6.5 miles wide. But because of this shallow angle of approach, the effectively safe channel was much more narrow. Here, Petrow compares the problem to shooting a soccer ball into the net from straight on versus shooting it from the sideline. It can still go in, but you need to be much more accurate with what you're doing.
They had to bend it like Beckham, basically.
Here, we're going to try to bend it like Ruggiati. However, Ruggiati's biggest concern at the time wasn't actually one of navigation, but one of cargo distribution. Due to Torrey Canyon's length and the way her cargo was distributed, she sagged in the middle. Ruggiati had been warned by the company's shipping agent that the vessel's draft amidships would need to be reduced to 52 feet 2 inches or less in order to enter Milford Haven during that night's high tide, which would come at 11 p.m. Torrey Canyon had 18 tanks, arranged as sets of 3 from bow to stern, of which 16 were used for oil. The number 3 port and starboard tanks were used exclusively for ballast water. To reduce the sag amidships, oil would need to be transferred from the middle tanks to the ones at the bow and stern, quoting from Petrow.
It would, at best, be a delicate operation. All cargo tanks were filled to a maximum, with only 4 feet of ullage or usable cargo space left on top. The crude oil would have to be transferred very slowly from one tank to another. The ullage would have to be constantly checked, and the man handling the shutoff valve would have to maintain constant alert for the transfer to be completed without spilling any oil. In rough seas, the transfer would not be attempted.
So this is a very lengthy process. It takes around 5 hours. But with the current estimated time of arrival of 4:30 p.m., this would leave Torrey Canyon plenty of time to wait outside the harbor, make her cargo transfer, and then enter with the 11 p.m. high tide.
Yeah, I guess it's not as bad to wait outside the harbor when you don't have U-boats trying to do their thing.
Not as big of a problem. However, if there were any significant delay in reaching Milford Haven and the sea conditions didn't permit the transfer while sailing, it was possible that Torrey Canyon could miss the high tide, which would mean an additional 6 days to wait for the next usable tide that would permit the tanker to enter Milford Haven.
That sounds like a lot of wasted money.
It does, so you want to avoid that. At 8 a.m., First Officer Bonfilio passed the watch to Third Officer Alfonso Cocchio after providing a briefing of the ship's current location and bearing. Cocchio was taken aback to find that they'd be passing the Scillies to the east. At 8:18, Captain Ruggiati ordered a slight port turn from 018 degrees to 015 degrees in order to bring Torrey Canyon through the open water between the Scillies and Seven Stones Reef.
I'm looking at this on Google Maps, and I'm assuming that the Seven Stones lightship is where the reef is.
Yes.
That is not a lot. It's just not a big space.
No, it isn't. And you can kind of see, though, where some of this tight schedule might play into it, because he's sort of doing everything possible to not make a really wide turn. He's trying to keep it like as straight as possible, even if it puts his ship in a pretty dangerous area. Another quote here from Petrow.
During the morning of March 18th, however, the current was moving in the direction of 130 degrees true. Its drift was not excessive, less than 1 mile an hour. For the current set and drift were turning the bow of the Torrey Canyon to the right, while Captain Ruggiati wanted to go left. The wind, too, coming from the northwest, was also pushing the Torrey Canyon to the right.
All of these environmental factors combined to keep the Torrey Canyon on her original bearing of 018 degrees. As our story develops, one of the disputed details of what happened in this last hour has to do with other vessels in the area of Seven Stones Reef. While tankers were rarely seen in this stretch of water, fishing vessels were very common around Seven Stones. On March 18th, 1967, there were 2 confirmed fishing vessels in the area. 2 French lobster boats, the Mater Christi and the Cité d'Arvour. In the subsequent investigation, Captain Ruggiati would claim that a 3rd vessel was in the area, contributing to his inability to complete the turn to port. None of the other officers involved would remember seeing a 3rd fishing vessel, and Captains Pierre Legoff and Guy Folique of the Cité d'Arvour and Mater Christi respectively would each attest that they were the only 2 fishing vessels on the reef that morning.
I mean, I feel like if the fishing vessels don't recall it, then it didn't exist, because what reason do they have to not tell the truth?
And they work around each other pretty frequently. They
like you're friends or enemies with a lot of these people. I imagine.
Exactly.
If deadliest catch is to be believed.
Yeah, I don't know if French lobster boats are as rough and tumble as Alaskan crab fishermen, but I could see them having some rivalries. Petrow, seeing the situation from Pierre Legoff's perspective, writes,
"It was a strange sight to see. Seldom do big ships come from that direction." He didn't waste much time on the strange ship, however. There was fishing at hand, and the ship, he thought, had plenty of time to turn to starboard and thus clear the rocks with safety.
What was the ship that we did with Josie, the one in Australia?
Pasha Bulker.
Pasha Bulker. This reminds me a bit of that, where there's that very famous pictures of Pasha Bulker, where you just have this massive ship so close to shore, like it's grounded on shore, and it just looks out of place. It just looks wrong to be that close to the shore. And that's kind of the vibe I get here is, these fishing captains, they spend tons of time out here. you to get used to what kind of stuff you're normally going to see. And seeing this massive oil tanker coming through here has got to just be jarring, because they're like, that's not in the right spot. It's not where that's supposed to go.
I mean, yeah, you just have to be wondering, why is he on this side of everything? Like, why is he not going around in the traditional sea lanes?
You got a whole ocean out there, man.
What this reminds me of is when you see clips of like semi trucks that try to go under too low of a bridge.
Kind of like that.
It's just like, why were you even on that road? There's signs that say don't do this.
Guy Falique, captain of the Mater Christi, would recall that he had never seen a large vessel approach from the direction that Torrey Canyon was. A fourth vessel in the area, as it always was a Seven Stones lightship.
Is there any chance that was the third vessel that the captain saw? Or like, noted on the radar?
No, because he identifies that one independently. He's very clear that there's another fishing vessel that's getting in the way of him making this turn.
Because like if the lightship's in the way of making your turn, that would tell me you are in fact in the wrong place to make the turn.
Not great. As the Torrey Canyon approached, the watch on the lightship consisted of two men, Leslie Matthews and Charles Lawrence, who'd begun their watch at 4 a.m. They sighted the Torrey Canyon around 8:30 a.m., though potentially as late as 8:40, neither watchman considered the tanker to be on a dangerous bearing.
I get the impression of everyone involved so far, it's more of an amusing thing than anything. It's like, what's he doing here?
Yeah, like, oh, it looks like somebody took a wrong turn. But yeah, even as late as this, the guys on the lightship who know this area pretty well, they know navigational, safe zones and channels and stuff, and they're not really panicked yet. They're not sending out warnings or anything until it becomes pretty clear what's going to happen. As the Torrey Canyon drifted inexorably towards the rocks, the situation was complicated by the inexperience of the 27-year-old third officer Cochio. This was also his first time sailing under Ruggiati. So throughout this, of course, a lot is written about Ruggiati, and he kind of appears as I don't know if divisive is the right word for it, but people have varying opinions of him. You have some people who are extremely personally loyal to Ruggiati, officers and crew, and you have some who don't seem to have much of a relationship with him at all. And I think some of that maybe is also on Ruggiati's side. How is he interacting with these people? He is the captain. He's kind of needs to establish those communication channels. You kind of get two very different pictures of who Ruggiati is as a captain reading about this. So this is Cochio's first time sailing under Ruggiati. During a period of about 10 minutes as they're approaching these rocks, Cochio took 3 incorrect fixes on the vessel's position, leading Ruggiati to take over the calculations. So he's basically using the wrong reference point, and he's placing them at an inaccurate distance away from the rocks, to the extent that Ruggiati just takes over and says, "Here, let me do it."
I guess how do you get to that position of being the third officer and not be able to do that competently? Because in theory, you have to be in charge at certain points of the day.
Also interesting to note here that this is one time when Ruggiati has to jump in and do something himself, which is typically not good when you have these, designated positions and roles that you're supposed to be doing.
Right, because I'm sure that's taking Ruggiati away from other things that he should be doing right now, too. Like, he has other responsibilities.
By the time he had an accurate read on their actual position, the Torrey Canyon was just 2.8 miles away from the nearest of the Seven Stones, and it's now 8:40 a.m.
Well, that's not good.
During this critical period when Torrey Canyon is approaching the rocks, Ruggiati had taken personal control of the helm also, with the actual helmsman, Biagio Scotto de Carlo, standing lookout on the starboard wing of the bridge.
That's kind of weird, I feel like.
That's one aspect of this that I think delves into kind of the strangeness of it, and where you can see, kind of like what you alluded to, there's definitely some issues of resource management here. Because you've got these other officers on the bridge, you have a helmsman on the bridge, and yet you have the captain, whether he feels he needs to or not, essentially doing everything. He's taking over the fix calculations, he's taking personal control of the helm, and he's, big picture captaining the ship.
I think him actually physically taking the helm is the one that's the most surprising to me.
Yeah, and that's also going to be a very, very big factor probably in what happens next. During the investigation, the handling of the helm would fall under considerable scrutiny. When Ruggiati was making his slight turn to port, that very, very minor adjustment from 018 to 015, he never took the helm off of the automatic setting, autopilot basically. You didn't need to, because changes of 3 degrees or less could be made without switching from automatic to manual. The vessel would not respond to turns of more than 3 degrees unless this change was made. So if you needed to make major adjustments, you had to switch it to manual. Just a matter of moving this lever to different position.
So automatic is essentially more of like an autopilot function. Like it's just going to go where it said, like where you tell it to go, basically.
Yes, it's programmed in with the route, and it's steering the ship on its own to hold that course. It was at 8:40 that Ruggiati made what was possibly the most critical decision of the whole ordeal. Rather than turning to starboard, where he had open water, and where, as we saw before, the other captains watching expected him to turn, Ruggiati decided to turn harder to port, to take him through the channel between Seven Stones and the Scillies.
That's wild.
So to make this turn into that channel, Ruggiati took the vessel off of automatic control and put it in manual. Turned the vessel to port on a heading of 0 degrees, so headed exactly north, to thread the needle through the channel. After making the turn, he switched the steering back to automatic and left the helm. Now in the chart room, Ruggiati and Cocchio tried to get an accurate fix on their location. This newest fix revealed that they were less than a mile from the closest rocks of Seven Stones Reef. Realizing the danger, Ruggiati yelled for helmsman Scotto to return to the helm. Now, I read this as him leaving the helm unattended.
Yeah, if you're telling him to go back to it, I'm assuming he thought he put it on the right course. And it's like, all right, well, we're good. Let's go figure out what our next move is. And then once they figured out where they actually were, they're like, oh, shit.
Oh, shit.
We don't have a next move.
So quoting here from Petrow.
Scotto, running in from the wing, found the captain already at the wheel. Repeating his orders, hard to port, Ruggiati commanded, go to 350. Immediately, he altered his command. Take her to 340. Take her to 320. Then the captain returned to the chart room.
Scotto put the wheel hard over. For a few seconds, he watched in growing amazement as the rudder indicator remained motionless.
Scotto shouted a warning to Captain Ruggiati. Captain, the ship is not turning. In the excitement on the bridge, his warning went unheard. Captain Ruggiati was too engrossed in examining the chart.
Can you guess why the ship's not turning?
Was it still on auto? But you know what? The helmsman got dismissed from his post and probably has no idea because he wasn't the one doing it all, which is why you should have one person doing it so they can keep track of what's going on.
You see this so often. Katie and I were just watching an episode of Air Disasters where it was a maintenance thing where, this job got passed off from one shift to the next and there was just no communication of what had been done or hadn't been done. And then, your wing falls off because someone took the bolts out of it. So after about a minute, which is a long time when you're approaching the rocks this close, Captain Ruggiati sensed something was wrong, namely because he couldn't hear the clicking of the ship's gyro compass, which would normally be audible if the ship's making a major course change, like the one he had been ordering Scotto to make. And yeah, that's kind of setting aside the fact that he's very quickly giving a bunch of different headings, telling him to go harder and harder and harder to port.
I'm picturing a lot of Italian men yelling at each other, basically. And it's also hard because if the captain's yelling all these orders, he's not listening to the feedback from the helmsman of, hey, ship won't turn. I mean, because in theory, okay, I know why it's not turning because it's on auto. Take it off auto.
And so this kind of also speaks to the experience and the communication of the crew. If this is a training thing, ideally you'd think that the helmsman turning the helm, not getting any response, would hopefully know some of the potential reasons why, how to troubleshoot this. If you're turning and the ship's not turning, what do you do?
I think it's sort of like the checklist you see a lot of times in air disasters, right? Like, what is the most common reason why it wouldn't turn? Like, item number 1, is it in auto? If it's not in auto and it's still not turning, like, go to the next thing.
And again, like this is just compounded by what you said, the issue of, passing this off kind of at random, saying, hey, go over here, be lookout. No, come back to the helm. And then not really communicating what's going on. What position is this in right now?
I mean, I think it's why, you hear like all the aircrew chatter all the time of them saying very specific things to each other. And there's a reason, even though they go really quick, there's a reason they say a very specific set of things to each other. So everyone knows what's going on. And when they skip it and they don't configure their flaps properly, they crash on takeoff. Like that's like a story we've seen in so many air disasters and stuff. And kind of you're seeing that play out here over a 45-minute span.
Skoto repeated his warning that the ship was not turning as Rajati scrambled to figure out why. Rajati picks up the phone to the engine room. As he is dialing the engine room to check for any mechanical explanation, maybe something has come detached from the rudder, something like this.
So like the other problem here is that Rajati doesn't remember that it's on auto because it's not really his job.
Right, because you could think he could easily say, oh, put it on manual, and that would troubleshoot this. So as he has the phone in his hand, he's dialing the engine room. Rajati has a line of sight on the steering lever, set not to manual, but actually to control, which is the third setting option. An auxiliary steering mode for use in case of the other steering systems failing.
When the steering mode selector lever was pushed forward into control, the steering wheel became inoperative, as in the automatic position. In control, the ship could be steered, not by the wheel, but by a handle located to the left of the wheel. In the normal course of sailing, the control position was seldom, if ever, used. So like now we have a switch that's in a like third position that would never normally be in. So even if the captain had been like, hey, it's on automatic, the guy's going to be like, no, it's not.
I forget the configuration, but the control is all the way forward. I believe manual is all the way back and automatic is in the middle. So from the helmsman's perspective, because the captain was not using the control setting. So what seems to have happened is that the helmsman took the helm, took it off of automatic, but possibly put it into the wrong position.
Interesting.
Pushing it forward instead of back.
Kind of just in the excitement of the situation.
Possibly, yes. Like you said, he wasn't the one who made the initial change. So, your muscle memory might not kick in as much.
This is the most airliner crash, shipwreck story I think we've ever done.
In the first chapter of the book, Petrow mentions that the officers of the Torrey Canyon were largely unfamiliar with the control setting. Several months earlier, Second Officer Fontana had tried it out on one of his watches, prompting Captain Rajati to ask, what was that? When he checked the course recorder and saw a zigzag in the route. So he's looking at the, what had been done on the previous watch. He sees this zigzag and he just asks, hey, what happened here? And Fontana just says, oh, I was just playing with the control to see what it did.
Don't touch things.
So back to our current story, Rajati sprinted from the chart room and moved the steering lever to manual and threw the Torrey Canyon hard to port with the help of Skoto. The oil tanker quickly began her turn, but it was far too late. At 8:50 a.m., Torrey Canyon slammed into Pollard Rock at a speed of 15.75 knots.
That's a lot of mass and speed.
Yeah, that's the other thing. She's going pretty fast when this happens.
It's one thing to get washed up onto the rocks. It's another thing to plow into them.
Yeah, it's not like she's slamming on brakes and barely scrapes this thing. The crews on board those two French fishing vessels had a front row seat to the wreck of the Torrey Canyon. On the Mater Christi, Captain Guy Folique told his men, stop work. You're going to see something extraordinary.
That probably sounded beautiful in French, too.
Arrêtez, arrêtez.
But also, I would be that way with it. Be like, hey, this is going to happen. We might.
You want to see something cool?
Right? Yeah, want to see something you can tell your kids about. I guess also, hey, we might have to go rescue some people. Who knows?
They watched as this massive tanker came to a dead stop. In Folique's estimation, that's the end of her. She'll never get off. On the Cité d'Arvor, there were similar reactions. First, desperate attempts to signal the tanker away from the rocks, followed by stunned silence.
It does have to be pretty surreal. I mean, it would be kind of like watching like an airplane crash, like knowing that you can't do anything about it, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, by the time that they're really trying to warn this ship away, it's way too late. As Captain Pierre Legoff in the Cité d'Arvor approached the grounded vessel, he could hear the tanker's engine still running at full speed, in addition to the metallic grating of the ship's hull being ripped open before she came to a total stop. Almost immediately, Legoff could see oil gushing out of the hull.
Better grab them lobsters while they're still clean.
Captain Guy Falique also brought his Mater Christi closer to the Torrey Canyon, and it was Falique who would send out the first official notification of the incident. This part was kind of weird, I guess, again, like maybe just no established protocols for something like this with a oil tanker wrecking in their fishing grounds. He didn't initially call it in as a mayday. And he originally called it into Radio Conquet, a French maritime station back in Brittany, where they were sailing from. He calls it in. He just basically says he's calling with, I don't know, I have news, I have a notification. And he's told, we're busy right now. You'll have to wait a minute by the operator. Not wanting to wait, he next raised Land's End Radio in Cornwall.
Land's End Radio, he broadcast. This is the French linguistier Mater Christi. This is Mater Christi from Audierne. I am reporting the tanker Torrey Canyon has run aground on the Seven Stones.
I also think here and there initially is a little bit of confusion when these calls are being made from the French fisherman perspective of like, why the hell is this tanker here? It's got to also be bizarre to receive that call at Land's End Radio saying, oh, Torrey Canyon is aground on Seven Stones. Being like, there has to be some mistake. Like, you've got to be reading the name wrong or something. There's no way that ship is there.
I mean, I feel like that's how a lot of like big disasters happen, is like you're always hit first with like, what? That didn't happen. Like, no, there's a mistake. I mean, sort of like, to go to like 9/11, right? When the first plane hit, everyone's like, oh, it's an accident. Like that's not on purpose. Like,
and then the second one is like, that's a massive coincidence. Wow.
Wow.
What if 9/11 had been two separate terrorist plots?
This happened to come together at the same time. I mean, Massoud was assassinated on the 10th, which I found out was actually a happy accident for the Taliban and stuff. It was not planned that way.
In addition to the other boats on hand to witness the incident, others soon became aware of what was happening on Seven Stones Reef. One of these was helicopter pilot James Summerlee, along with his co-pilot Richard Sadler. Summerlee flew regular flights from Penzance Airport in Cornwall to the Scilly Islands.
I think they got pirates in Penzance, don't they?
They do have some. And now those pirates have to deal with this oil, too.
Pirates of Penzance, too.
Around 9 a.m., as the aircraft was making its way across the water to the Scillies, Sadler noticed something odd.
What on earth is that ship doing on the wrong side of the lightship? And what's that funny smell?
Oil, Summerlee was quickly able to diagnose.
The smell was so strong that both pilots thought immediately that they had a malfunction in the aircraft. Rapidly, they checked their instruments. The oil pressure and oil temperature in both engines were normal. So was the oil temperature in the gearbox. The smell was not coming from their helicopter. Summerlee and Sadler, relieved, turned their attention to the ship below. They could see she was no longer underway. They also saw a large purplish smudge in the water around the tanker.
What's interesting here is that neither pilot initially thought the ship was in trouble. They actually assumed that she was approaching the Seven Stones lightship to take someone off, like there was a medical emergency or something, and that she had jettisoned oil to calm the sea in the area.
Is that a thing you were allowed to do at any point?
Yeah, actually. Yeah. Really common, actually.
I guess I wasn't aware of that.
Or fairly, I don't know about really common, but it was a thing that was done enough that when people first see this, they don't initially take it for a grounding and an oil spill, an accidental oil spill.
Yeah, those two are like, listen, we're helicopter, we're air people, we're not water people. We don't know, that's not our domain.
They did call the BEA control tower on the Scillies to ask if they knew anything about the tanker, or if the Coast Guards had been informed. They had not. So the news is trickling out at this point still. As we're getting into the actual spill itself, it's a good time for a little aside to discuss some of the sensory details that'll come up in many of the descriptions of the spill. There, of course, we saw that the smell was so strong, they initially think this is coming from their own helicopter, like they're right on top of this. They also mentioned the color, and they describe it as purplish. Oil does weird stuff with lights. The reflections kind of almost has like a rainbow quality at some points. One of the sources that was really useful during the research for this was from the Journal of Social History, an article titled Community and Exclusion, the Torrey Canyon Disaster of 1967 by Anna Green and Timothy Cooper. The overall focus of the article is how the wreck is remembered in local communities and some of the frictions that developed between local community and the wider national government communities that were on hand to deal with the spill. Two things of note from that last quote, and that was the smell and the color. A lot of firsthand accounts include very visceral sensory descriptions, almost to the extent that you can kind of experience this secondhand. You can imagine what this smells and feels and looks like. There's a fairly extended quote here I'd like to include from Community and Exclusion.
The senses of sound, vision, touch, taste, and smell perform a significant function in prompting recall, and the Torrey Canyon stories nearly always begin with a description of the smell. This reflects the Proust effect, the powerful role of smell in triggering memory, and many of those interviewed recalled being aware of the smell before hearing about the shipwreck or seeing the oil slick coming ashore. They describe the smell of the oil as nauseous, a stench, foul, and pungent.
The oil was nearly always remembered as brown, in contrast to references in books and commemorative programs to the black tide.
In Porthleven Harbor, the oil looked like melted chocolate, and in Marazion, mulligatawny soup. The oil made the sea shine while subduing the waves. The oil was thick, brown, stinchy muck, like mud on top of the water.
So yeah, I kind of like that little reference to, I think I mentioned in part one how this Petrow book in the UK, it was published as The Black Tide. And kind of that description being something that you'd imagine in your head, maybe if you hadn't seen the oil spill in person, as being accurate. Whereas the people here, none of them are really describing it that way. This is the first time any of these people are really dealing with something like this, so it subverts a lot of expectations of what it might look like. That article also includes another quote from a local fireman who is on hand to assist in the cleanup.
There were virtually no waves. You say you spread oil on troubled waters to smooth them, and it does. Because this, of course, was thick crude oil. It was not black. It was chocolate brown. And it sort of subdued the waves so that they rippled in onto the beach. And the next one would flow over the top of that. And when each wave receded, it simply left the residue on the beach. So that was my first impression. It was not quite what we sort of thought it was going to be.
After landing in the Scillies, Summerlee and Sadler's return trip brought them back directly over the wreck. Now, they were able to confirm that the ship was aground, and they reported that she was leaking a terrific amount of oil on the water. It was the Land's End radio station that would issue the general SOS that would get the attention of all vessels in the area, and quite a few responded saying they could be in the area within the next few hours.
What's preventing the Torrey Canyon from giving any information out?
That I don't know, other than panic.
Because I feel like, I guess maybe partially because the captain's trying to plot the course, drive the vessel, and do everything else. Normally, I guess he'd be the one to tell someone, like, hey, issue an SOS.
And I think also part of it is, as we'll see here, is that it kind of takes a little bit of time for everyone to establish that she is very, very, very hard aground, and she's not going to move. Among the vessels that responded to this SOS, quite a few in the area start steaming towards Seven Stones. One of them even, they get a response, apparently, from a ship that is like hundreds of miles out into the Atlantic, saying that they can head that way. And they're sort of waved off, saying thank you, but we have other much, much closer people. But there's a lot of response to this. Among these vessels is the Dutch salvage tug Utrecht, which had been stationed just off of Penzance. Here's our Pirates of Penzance, we could say.
For Utrecht and other salvage tugs, a distress call means work. It is the call they wait to hear. Utrecht was stationed in Mounts Bay for just such an emergency. The race was on for the salvage prize, and Utrecht was admirably placed to win it.
We will check back in with the Utrecht shortly. And this part reminded me of the book The Grey Seas Under by Farley Mowat.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was our friend and fellow podcaster Paul who had recommended that one. That was a really fascinating read, just kind of seeing how the salvage business works and how cutthroat. I mean, that part makes sense because it's a business, but how, like, the sort of competition that goes into it and the sort of, we spend a lot of time, telling these shipwreck stories and talking about ships from kind of the human side of it and how dry and emotionless, salvage has to naturally be, as a business. And yeah, just jumping on these things as soon as possible because it is a necessary service. You're potentially saving a ship, you're potentially saving lives. And yeah, so this is a great example of kind of how that process works with a big vessel like this.
So, like, what in the kind of a smaller scale situation, what that reminds me of, especially in like a bigger city like Chicago, if you have like a semi truck that breaks down and like the cops respond to it, or you have an accident, you don't call the wrecker; they come to you, and it's literally a race between various, wrecker companies as to who gets there first. And the cops are pretty much like, it's yours now. Go ahead. We don't care where you take it, but we don't want it here.
It's the trucker version of we don't call 911.
So yeah, it's funny to see, it's sort of salvage or wrecking in any industry is sort of the same thing. It is very emotionless and cutthroat.
This section is titled The Spill. We'll start getting into it. We'll talk in a bit more detail in later episodes. One of the first people to identify the potentially massive oil problem was Commander Michael Garnett of the Royal Navy, Staff Operations Officer for Vice Admiral Fitzroy Talbot.
I'm not going to lie to you. I'm confident that if I'd been anywhere near there and seen this, I would have predicted a little bit of an oil problem.
This is also one of the issues of this is really the first time this happens with a big tanker and the potential for her entire cargo to be spilled.
I guess that's true. A lot of people at this time especially would have experience with, a U-boat attack or something like that, where obviously there's oil or something in the water, but it's a little different than this.
This is well before the time of double-hulled tankers, which we'll talk about more in part 3, some of the changes to the industry that eventually happen. So, there's really not that much to these things, to the hull. Mm-hmm. Obviously you want to save weight as much as possible because you want to carry more stuff, more oil. And so no one really, or few people, I guess, really realize the potential that, hey, if one of these things runs aground and it rips open all these things, it's going to lose 100,000 tons of oil into the ocean. I think 119,000 is what she was carrying. So Commander Garnett, he first dispatched the destroyer Barossa to the scene and set about making a series of calls concerning the dispersal of the oil at sea. He's kind of the first person who, rather than just responding to a shipwreck, realizes we're responding to a potential ecological nightmare. In part 1, we mentioned that Torrey Canyon was the first major marine oil spill, but this wouldn't actually be the Navy's first experience dealing with oil in the water. In 1960, an oil tanker, the Esso Portsmouth, had suffered an explosion at the Esso refinery in Milford Haven while unloading crude oil. At some point, not that long after she started unloading, there was some kind of spark in one of the, unloading apparati, and causes this explosion. I couldn't find a ton of stuff about this, and some sources listed one person killed in the explosion. Some did not mention that, but from a spill perspective, most of her cargo is actually unaffected. The ship does take some pretty serious damage, and Petrow writes that about 250 tons of oil escaped from the Esso Portsmouth.
That's wild. That's a small amount.
Obviously, that's a lot of oil, for you or me to spill. But coming out of one of these tankers, it's a pretty small portion of what she's carrying. So another quote here from Petrow.
The Milford Haven Slick had been treated with detergent, a chemical that acts by breaking up the oil and making it easily dispersed in water. Zoological studies conducted later by Swansea University showed that 30% of the marine life in the immediate vicinity of the spill had been killed by the detergent, though the detergent did do an effective job on the oil.
So, two revealing things about this quote. First off, is that the oil is dispersed at the expense of marine life. We think of the oil itself being the thing that kills marine life. And in many ways it does. A lot of your larger, more visible marine life, your birds, your fish, are going to be harmed by the oil. However, this detergent is going to kill everything.
Yeah, that gives me real, we had to destroy the village to save it energy.
Yeah, as we'll see, this is the real sort of Sophie's choice is the kind of term I'm looking for here, but there's not really a good option because if you leave the oil, of course, that's going to cause all the problems on the beaches. Whereas if you use this detergent, it is going to disperse the oil to an extent, but it's going to kill everything on the surface, under the surface, microorganisms. All of that is going to be killed by this detergent. Second, this was a fairly small amount of oil that the detergent was able to deal with. Both of those are going to be significant during the cleanup efforts with Torrey Canyon. And then also, even just the term detergents. Some of the writings about this point out how that term, even just to the general public, conveys a certain amount of normalness or like comfort and cleanliness. You use detergent on your clothes, you use detergent to clean your dishes. It usually has a nice, pleasant, fresh cotton scent or lavender or something like this.
I've seen the Dawn commercial with the oil-covered bird.
It doesn't really capture how toxic and corrosive this stuff is, to the point that, it's causing, chemical irritation on people's skin who are around it. If you inhale this stuff, it's not that good for you. And it kills a massive amount of marine life as they're using this detergent. So, predicting the potential disaster resulting from the oil spill, Commander Garnett requested a blank check to deal with the spill. Much of this to be spent on the commensurate required amount of detergent for this much, much larger oil spill. He was authorized to begin operations, although rather than a blank check, he was given a budget of £1,000.
I realized that that's more money, like when this story took place, but it's still not that much money for what you're trying to do.
Part of this is the fact that people don't realize quite yet how big this could be. And so if your strategy is just, we need enough detergent to deal with all this oil, you're probably going to need more money than that. Plus the whatever expenses in dispatching ships to this area.
Mm-hmm.
So initially the minesweeper Clarbeston was dispatched to the spill with 1,000 gallons of detergent, and the tug Sea Giant would also arrive soon with 3,500 gallons of detergent. So we'll pause there in terms of dealing with the spill. We'll come back to that in the next episode. Let's get to the salvage.
Okay.
So at 11 a.m. later the same morning, Royal Navy Lieutenant Michael Clark was lowered by helicopter onto the deck of the Torrey Canyon so that he could connect with the crew and conduct an inspection of the vessel. So from this inspection, he kind of goes below and he looks at what he can see of the whatever potential damage to the hull of Torrey Canyon. He reports back to his headquarters with the following information.
10 of her 18 tanks are ruptured. There's heavy discharge of oil coming from the ship. She's hard aground midships. There's another rock forward on the starboard side. The main pump room is flooded, and water is leaking into the engine room. She's rolling heavily and grinding a lot.
So she's not great. She's not doing well here.
It doesn't sound wonderful.
When the salvage tug Utrecht arrived, they presented Captain Rujati with a no-cure, no-pay salvage contract from the Weissmuller Company of IJmuiden in the Netherlands. Rujati signed the contract, giving Weissmuller the right to salvage the Torrey Canyon. So here, just so I don't forget, near the end of part 1, we talked about Rujati's early career and his captain when he was in the Regia Marina. And that captain had given him his captain's maneuver whistle, we also mentioned that that captain had been on a ship that sank that he had escaped from.
Mm-hmm.
And I had redacted the location of where that ship sank.
Uh-huh.
And it sank just off the Scilly Isles. Ruggiati, of course, had that maneuver whistle around his neck when this was happening. So kind of a weird cosmic connection here in Ruggiati's career, where he kind of gets this thing that sort of spurs him on earlier in his career, and that same place is where his career is going to come to an end.
The whistle yearns for the rocks.
So a bit more here about that no cure, no pay salvage contract that Ruggiati fairly quickly, reads and signs.
Under the uncompromising deep-sea salvage principle of no cure, no pay, Weissmuller would have to assume all the costs of the operation if the salvage attempt failed. If his men were successful in refloating Torrey Canyon, however, he could expect to reap a whirlwind profit of at least 10% of the value of the vessel. At the very least, a successful salvage would mean $1 million award to Weissmuller. No cure, no pay had its risks, but they were well worth the running. At least they seemed so to Weissmuller that Saturday.
I think it's interesting in that quote that it talked about he could expect to reap a whirlwind profit, because like in the whole quote about sowing the wind and reaping the whirlwind, like that's not a good thing. That's not like, oh, great, cool, I get the whirlwind. He referred to in the quote here is Arthur Weissmuller, the head of the firm, but the man in charge for the company on scene is actually going to be salvage chief Hans Stahl. We'll see him a bit in a couple minutes.
I don't hate the way that this works. It sort of incentivizes everyone to work to the same objective.
Well, also that highlights one of the things where, being a captain of any of these big merchant vessels, it's one of those big responsibilities that you might potentially have to shoulder, especially in an era where rapid communication is not quite as easy. Is that, if you're the captain, one of the things you're sort of invested with is you have to make this decision of, are you going to sign this salvage contract or not? Is your ship in need of salvage, or do you think you can free it on your own? So Ruggiati signs the contract, and they get to work. The first attempts to free Torrey Canyon from the rocks the following day, so this is Sunday, were pretty straightforward, simply attaching a steel hawser to the tanker and trying to pull her free. If you remember the Royal Navy Lieutenant's report, it's probably not going to work.
Yeah, he seemed pretty confident.
They had, I think it was a 5-inch steel hawser that they attached to the stern of Torrey Canyon to try to haul her off of the rocks. And I believe it was just the tug Utrecht that was tugging her at this point. It kind of says a lot about what these salvage crews think they can do. Saying this is just one tug, but pretty sure they can haul this pretty big oil tanker off of these rocks.
I guess sort of in that same thing, they have the incentive of doing it themselves, because if you bring in another crew, you have to start paying them.
The Utrecht strained to pull her off until this steel hawser snapped, leaving the Torrey Canyon right where she was.
Can you imagine that thing snapping and flying?
Do you want Ghost Ship? Because this is how you get Ghost Ship.
It's like some Final Destination stuff.
And so Torrey Canyon, she had gone aground at high tide, so she had only settled further onto the rocks in the meantime. So all of that grinding and groaning they were hearing was just her settling deeper and deeper onto the rocks. The whole crew of Torrey Canyon initially stayed on board, but with the potential of heavy weather incoming, Ruggiati decided that all officers and crew could leave if they wished, in case the ship were to break up in the storm, but that he would stay on board. He asked for any volunteers who wished to remain. Only 3, I believe the total crew is 21. Only 3 of them decided to stay. These were able seaman Michele de Candia and Lucio Acciaro, and steward's mate Mario Girgenti. All 3 of them stayed for reasons of personal loyalty to Ruggiati. Girgenti, for example, he was also from Elba, so he had that connection. He had known Ruggiati for 21 years. Girgenti's wife had gone to school with Ruggiati, so there's quite a bit of connection here. He feels a good bit of attachment to his captain.
It's interesting that none of the other officers stayed.
Right, as you'll notice, none of the bridge officers decided to stay.
Unlike one of the last Italian captains we talked about, though, this captain is at least staying with the ship. Think back to the Oceanos.
Yes, this is true. We do have an Italian captain sticking with his ship. Also, I guess in the Lepanto episodes, we had some not great performances from Italian captains as well. After this evacuation, there would be only the captain, the 3 crew, and 2 salvagers on board. So these are just the initial sort of contact group of these salvagers.
That's got to be kind of an extreme lifestyle, though, to be one of those salvagers. Like, you're willingly going onto the shipwrecked vessel and being like, well, I'm just going to stay here.
So on Sunday, 5 Dutch salvage experts arrived, led by salvage chief Hans Staal, who we mentioned before. The following day, Monday, March 20th, the rest of the Dutch salvage team, 15 in all, arrived. They had come with 3 more tugs, the Titan and Stentor from Weissmuller, and the larger Portuguese tug Praia de Andraga that was hired for this operation. With the initial brute force plans of just yanking it off the rocks, a total failure, the new plan was to seal off the decks of the Torrey Canyon, pump her full of compressed air to increase her buoyancy, and float her off the rocks at the next high tide with the assistance of the tugs. Things are going well at first. The increased buoyancy was having a notable effect as the ship slowly righted herself, nearly to an upright position. And I believe this is the following day this is happening.
Mm-hmm.
This part's not great with documenting when stuff is happening. But at 11 a.m., Salvage Chief Hans Staal had one of his men go down to the engine room to check the water levels, saying the ship appears to be, raising a little bit, righting itself. Hopefully the water is going down in the lower levels of the ship. Quoting here from Petrow on how everything suddenly went very wrong on board Torrey Canyon.
Down below, the salvage engineer who had been sent to inspect the engine room reached his destination. He grabbed the handle of the door, turned it, pushed, and was thrown back as the engine room exploded with horrifying force. The explosion ripped upwards through the main deck of the tanker, where the swimming pool was located, and the structural strength of the tanker's steel deck was weakest.
Giant hunks of metal flew through the air. One salvage man, Rodriguez Virgilio, was lifted clean off the tanker and flung into the sea like a piece of unwanted debris. On the boat deck, Captain Rajati ducked as a large part of the swimming pool flew towards him, slamming into the deck 15 feet from where he crouched.
Alphonse Corneliscus, a Dutch welder, was on the center castle of the ship when the blast occurred. He looked up and saw Captain Staal walking on the deck with his back towards the pool. A piece of metal was arcing through the air towards him. Corneliscus shouted a warning. Staal turned, but it was too late. The jagged piece of shrapnel sliced across his spine and carried him through the ship's railing into the water below.
Both Staal and the other salvager, Virgilio, were recovered from the water by the tug Titan. The rest of the men on board the tanker also evacuated on the tug and were headed for the mainland by 12:45. A naval doctor, Frank Golden, was dropped onto the Titan by helicopter to tend to Staal, whose injuries were clearly very serious.
From what he could see, Golden believed that Staal had suffered a ruptured liver, a broken back, and had lost a massive amount of blood. Staal kept calling for oxygen, a common reaction when there is loss of blood. But Golden had no blood to administer to his patient, nor had he any oxygen.
Hans Staal would die as the tug made its way to shore, and Staal would actually be the only human casualty of the Torrey Canyon, which, given the potential situation here, was very fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are going to stop things there for now. In part 3, we are going to look at how the spill was ultimately dealt with. We're going to get the RAF involved. We're going to talk about the ecological impact, not just on Cornwall, but actually probably more so on Brittany, on the coast of France. And we'll talk about some of the aftermath, some of the legal aspects of the accident, and then ultimately the legacy we're left with from the wreck of the Torrey Canyon. Any, not final, but medial thoughts, I guess, in our story?
Not really. It's just a really interesting story, hearing about, kind of like you said, the first like truly catastrophic oil spill, I guess you could go with. It's very interesting just how people reacted to it. It's almost like no one really knew what to do. It's also interesting getting a glimpse into that salvage world. I find that very interesting.
Yeah, they mentioned that being a very big risk, and here we'll see kind of the downside of that risk. You're thinking about from that perspective, you're thinking of the money you're going to make from this, and we're going to see in part 3 how they don't really end up getting what they thought they would get out of the Torrey Canyon. Sometimes the gamble does not pay off. Sometimes your gamble goes up in flames.
Just like a 5-leg parlay that I put in.
All right, so with that, we will sign off here. We'll have one more main episode on Torrey Canyon, and we will have a bonus on Torrey Canyon coming out soon as well. So with that, thank you all for listening. Thank you all for your support, and we will talk to you again soon.